Honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to panel 2 that undertakes a review of 5 years of action and the progress made in implementing SDGs, SDG goal number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to take this opportunity to thank our moderator and speakers in panel 1 for their outstanding presentations. And also I would like to remind our audience that the speech materials will be documented and published in our conference proceedings, and the videos will be uploaded on the UNGA conference website and YouTube channels. And another announcement, the CSW 65 will be held in March 2021, and we want to encourage you to participate in the CSW events and discussions. You can get more information on www.ngocsw.org. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for panel 2, Ms. Paula Boland, who is the president of the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area, which is one of the oldest and largest division of the United Nations Association of the USA. Ms. Boland is also the chair of the UNA USA National Council. Ms. Boland is an attorney specializing in environmental law and international affairs. Ms. Boland assisted a number of environmental non-governmental organizations in developing conservation projects in Latin America. She has played a significant role in developing and nurturing strategic partnerships, diversifying membership, and expanding program activities. Ms. Paula Boland, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Leek, and the Journalists and Writers Foundation for your kind invitation to participate in your signature program, UNGA Conference 2020, at a critical time when world leaders are gathering virtually to address unprecedented challenges, from a global pandemic to vast inequalities, and to bring global solutions as the UN turns 75 years old this coming October. As the UN Secretary General Guterres said, this is a time to reflect and learn from the past and take action for a more sustainable future. Today's second panel will be focusing on implementing Sustainable Development Goal 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. In 2015, United Nations member states adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which includes 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Through Global Goal 16, member states have committed to promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. When the international community looked back on the Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, governance emerged as a critical element in explaining the uneven progress across these goals in many countries. One of the lessons from the MDGs was that democratic governance, peace and security, and the rule of law, including protection of human rights, are critical to sustainable development. A human rights approach helps identify who is vulnerable or being left behind, and the ways in which those who are marginalized can be empowered to overcome their vulnerability. The 2030 Agenda presents a shift, a significant shift and radical new approach to transforming our world, focusing on the integrated pillars of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental. It is universal, including issues such as inequality, access to justice, peace and security, and aims at leaving no one behind. Moreover, the SDG agenda has an additional complexity in terms of its implementation and requires a mix of national ownership, flexibility, innovation, political acumen, high-quality technical support, and collective multi-stakeholder effort at all levels in order to become progressively a reality. SDG 16 is key to achieving the transformative 2030 Agenda. Its focus on 7 principles of strong institutions, effective, inclusive, responsive, participative, representative, accountable, and transparent, as well as peaceful society are necessary for achieving all SDGs. This is true whether the goal is related to education, health, economic growth, climate change, or beyond. Without sustaining peace, which goes beyond the mere absence of violence and includes respect for human rights and the rule of law, development gains are reversed. And without inclusion and access to justice for all, inequalities in poverty reduction and socioeconomic development will increase, and countries' commitment to leaving no one behind will not be met. Goal 16 has the potential to catalyze profound social transformation. Transformation requires addressing the root causes and drivers that generate and reproduce economic, social, political, and environmental problems and inequities, not merely the symptoms. Transformation involves changes in social structures, institutions, and relations, including patterns of inequalities related to income, gender, ethnicity, religion, or geography that might lock people into positions of disadvantage or limit their choices. Global Goal 16 means changing norms and institutions that shape the behavior of people and organizations in the social, economic, environmental, and political spheres. Without specific attention to how SDG 16 applies in all dimensions of human life, it will be impossible to realize the transformative potential of the SDGs. SDG 16 also has tremendous value as an enabler and accelerator for all SDGs. The term SDG 16 plus acknowledges the other SDG targets that contribute to peace, justice, and responsive institutions. SDG 16 plus offers a framework for institutions at all levels to build peaceful, just, and inclusive society that place human rights protection and inclusive and accountable governance at the heart, at the center of tackling inequality. The SDG 16 framework provides countries with a rights-based approach to tackling the drivers of suffering that affords dignity and agency to those left behind. Now, advancement towards ending violence, promotion of the rule of law, and the strengthening of institutions and increasing access to justice are uneven and continue to deprive millions of their security, rights, and opportunities, and undermine the delivery of public services and broader economic development. Attacks on civil society are also holding back development progress. Renewed efforts are essential to move towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goal 16. The number of people fleeing war, persecution, and conflict is nearing 80 million, the highest level recorded by the UN Refugee Agency. In 2019, the UN tracked 357 killings and 30 enforced disappearances of human rights defenders, journalists, and trade unionists in 47 countries. And the birth of around 1 in 4 children under age 5 worldwide are never officially recorded, depriving them of a proof of legal identity, crucial for the protection of their rights, and for access to justice and social services. We cannot hope for sustainable development without peace, stability, human rights, and effective governance based on the rule of law. Yet our world is increasingly divided. Some regions enjoy more peace, security, and prosperity than others, while many are falling into seemingly endless cycles of conflict and violence. This is not inevitable and must be addressed. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Natalia Marcela Molina, who will be focusing on the promotion and protection of human rights. Natalia is a judge specializing in cyber crimes against minors of the city of Buenos Aires, Argentina. Incidentally, Natalia, where I am from. She has certifications in criminal law and organized crimes. She's a member of the International Association of Women Judges and second vice president of the Women Judges Association in Argentina. Judge Molina is a professor at Universidad de San Isidro and Universidad de Ciencias Empresariales in online crimes, focusing on gender issues and sexual slavery. Judge Molina, welcome. Muchas gracias por estar con nosotros. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Paula. Muchas gracias. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank you for the opportunity to be here and have the chance to share my words with you today. I am a criminal judge in Argentina, more specifically in the city of Buenos Aires. And my mission today is to inspire you to start actively working on campaigns that inform and promote the importance of children's human rights. As a consequence of COVID pandemic, online education and communication has increased drastically, which has led to the early exposure of our children to digital environment and their threats. The production and distribution of child sexual abuse content and online harassment is a crime in many countries and is growing as we speak. Both of these crimes take place in the digital environment, more specifically in social media, but it's important to mention that in all cases, they are committed offline and recorded to later on being uploaded in the internet. Once the image or videos are online, they automatically become a part of an enormous child sexual abuse network that not only expose the pain of this victim to millions, but put at risk, once again, their physical and psychic integrity. During this last couple of months, this type of crime have increased strongly in Argentina, and the number keeps growing every minute that goes by. But it's truly frightening in that there are no boundaries for this crime, and that even today there are many countries that still don't have any type of law to prevent or punish these terrible acts. Even in Latin America, which is, at the moment, the most advanced region in the implementation is these new measures, we are still learning and faces challenges. There is no doubt to me that this problem needs to be a part of the agenda in all countries, but especially in those who have not yet implemented law to ensure justice for victims and prevent this from happening over and over again. It is absolutely necessary that this country reconsider their position and adapt their legislation to guarantee the human rights of children that are abused under the eyes of the world. Non-profit organizations can help minimize this issue in many ways, such as actively working on campaigns that expose this topic and bring conscience to governments in order for them to put new law in the agenda that will help resolve this matter. Cybercrime, organized or not, has no boundaries and expands fast, which is we need a world that is united with international collaboration and fluent communication on this topic. All of you here today have a key role in society, and it is my wish to encourage you and your organization to expose this issue and help bring conscience to your communities. This effort will not only help prevent these horrible acts, but will also put pressure on your governments to modify their legislation to ensure justice to all victims. Right now, as I give my speech, there are dozens of people online distributing and consuming child sexual abuse content, and their victims keep getting younger and younger. We need your help to stop this. We need to start working on campaigns that inform and prevent online sexual harassment of minors at all levels. Let's call the attention of our governments, as it is their responsibility to teach not only kids about this matter, but also their parents, so that they can share this knowledge with their children and prevent them from being exposed to this type of danger. Let's work actively on digital education, the concept of privacy and the prevention of cyber abuse. The world has changed and it will keep changing. Today, a kid alone in his room playing with his laptop or maybe his PlayStation, because the PlayStation today is online too, without the correct digital education or supervision, is no longer safe. Information is freedom. Privacy is freedom too. Let's talk about this. Let's work on prevention. Let's inspire all countries to acknowledge this problem and work on their legislation in order to minimize this issue. This is a priority. We need to be committed. We need to be strong. Let's expose this and encourage victims to report these acts. This is really, really important. Let's help them lose their fear. There are excellent professionals willing to help us, for example, the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who has been doing a magnificent job, and in which website you can find lots of information on how to prevent or report this type of events. There is something I want to make very clear. Child sexual abuse content is not child pornography. Child pornography do not exist, as sexual activities are a part of the adult world and they are supposed to take place with consent from all parties. Child sexual abuse content is nothing like that. It's about the suffering and hurting of minors, and addressing it the wrong way continues to harm the integrity of children over and over again. Finally, kids are the most valuable part of society, and it is our job to do everything in our power to ensure a safer and better world for all of them. So, let's get to it. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Many thanks, Judge Molina, for your contributions. Okay. I would like now to introduce our second panelist, Michael Collins, who will focus on the decline of democratic values and rise of autocracy globally. Mr. Collins is the Executive Director of the Americas Institute for Economics MPs, based in New York. He helps manage IAP relations with the US government and the United Nations, develops working partnerships with US-based civil society organizations, foundations, universities, businesses, and think tanks, and seeks opportunities to build presence and impact through North, Central, and South America. Michael, welcome.
Thank you very much, Paula. That's appreciated. I'd like to share some findings from a recent IEP, the report, which kind of sort of try and provide additional insight into how well we're doing with regards to reducing violence and a lot of sort of the targets and indicators relative to SDG 16. So I'm just going to bring that up on screen now. The Institute for Economics and Peace, we're a non-profit, non-partisan research institute. We're dedicated to shifting the world's focus to peace as a positive, tangible and achievable measure of human well-being and progress. The origins of the Institute stem essentially from the question, what are the most peaceful countries on Earth? And at the time, there was sort of a lot of debate about this, but there was very little quantitative research around this subject. So the Global Peace Index stems from the desire to answer that question, as well as to track trends in peace and to also calculate the economic cost of violence as a way of incentivizing peace-building activities. So thankfully, that work has been very well received, and it's consulted frequently by a variety of multilateral organizations and governments around the world, as well as in excuse me, university courses, and it's shared very frequently online. This has given us the opportunity to be able to open up a variety of international offices that would be extremely happy to hear from any one of you. So this is the 14th year of the Global Peace Index, and it ranks 163 countries according to their relative state of peace. So the definition of peace in the index is the lack of violence or fear of violence. And we track that using 23 different indicators. And the methodology for doing that is developed by IEP, but it is sort of overseen by an international panel of experts. So the indicators are largely distributed in 3 domains. So the first one is related to domestic and international conflict. The second is related to measures of safety and security within society. And the third is the degree of militarization. Let's jump straight into some of the key findings for the 2020 report. This is sort of a mud map. Essentially, the countries in red are the least peaceful, the countries in green are the most peaceful. And you can actually access this in an interactive way in our website. You can click on any individual country, have a look at their indicators, and actually see the trends in indicators over the last 10 years. Overall, we see that the average level of peacefulness has deteriorated by 0.34%. That's the 9th deterioration in the last 12 years. 81 countries became more peaceful, 80 countries deteriorated, and improvements were driven by changes in terrorism, the impact of terrorism, homicides, weapons imports and exports, and deteriorations by the political terror scale, refugees and IDPs, and intensity of internal conflict. Now, today's talk is going to focus slightly on democracies versus authoritarian regimes. The political terror scale would be a sort of a generally accurate representation of this. So this refers to things like extrajudicial killings, imprisonment without trial, and torture. These are the 10 most peaceful countries for the 2020 report. All of these, with the exception of Singapore, are considered or esteemed to be full democracies. These are the 10 least peaceful countries. All of these, with the exception of South Sudan, that hasn't made it into the metric that we consult, are deemed to be authoritarian regimes. Now, in terms of trends of peace, I mentioned before that we've seen a decline in peace over the last 12 years. And this graph here may not initially be intuitive because we're measuring negatives. When we see charts go up like this, that means that there's been a deterioration. So please bear that in mind for the charts that you will see next. Overall, 81 countries became less peaceful. 79 countries became more peaceful, highlighting that decreases in peace are larger than increases in peacefulness. And overall peace over the last 10, 12 years has declined by 2.5%. When we break this out into the 3 domains that I mentioned before, we see that levels of militarization have continued to improve by 4.5%, a small deterioration in safety and security, but there has been a significant increase in ongoing conflict that is largely in authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. Now, breaking this out a tiny bit more, we do see a general difference even in trends with regards to levels of peacefulness for democracies versus authoritarian regimes. But interestingly, we do see a significant decrease in peacefulness in democracies over the last, in full democracies over the last 5 years, that correlates very closely with the civil unrest we've been seeing since the 2015 Syrian refugee crisis. So this is breaking down these indicators slightly more. We see that the deaths from terrorism are now at the lowest point that they have been in the last decade, but that comes from coming off a very large spike that coincides with the Iraq and Syria war. We often see a very close correlation between battle deaths and the impact of terrorism, because terrorism is essentially used as an instrument of war. We've seen that the number of refugees and IDPs has steadily increased in the world. On the flip side, on the good side, I suppose you could say, we have seen a sustained decrease in global homicide rates. In terms of ongoing conflicts, the battle deaths spike that you see here was the wars in Iraq and Syria primarily. As those have come to a close, we've seen that go down. But like I mentioned before, we have seen an increase in numbers of conflicts. So we've seen that the large sort of theaters of war, the Syrias, the Iraqs, the Afghanistans have drawn to a close or become smaller. But we've seen a sprouting up of smaller regional conflicts around the world. Very briefly, in terms of militarization, a general decrease in armed forces personnel, general sustained decrease in military expenditure, although we have seen a steady increase in the number of weapons imports. So the economic impact of violence in 2020 we calculate to be $14.5 trillion. That's kind of sort of a difficult number to fathom, but it basically equates to 10% of the world's GDP, or nearly $2,000 per person. So I know that we can't sort of imagine a world that's completely peaceful, but hey, what if we could make it 10% more peaceful? Well, that would mean that there's $1.5 trillion that could be used to other economic activities, ideally, or a variety of activities, ideally activities that are going to contribute further to development of peacefulness. So this brings me to positive peace, which refers to the attitudes, institutions, and structures that create and sustain peaceful societies. So this is a term that's used commonly in the peace building field, but we've tried to develop a quantitative measure for. And essentially what we've tried to do is take results from the Global Peace Index and compare that with thousands of measures of socioeconomic progress to see which are the ones that correlate most closely with subsequent ups and downs in a country's level of peace, right? To be able to see essentially what makes peace tick. There are 300 indicators that correlate very closely, and those, generally speaking, fall into 8 buckets, which we call the 8 pillars of positive peace. They are these ones. These are the characteristics of the most peaceful societies on Earth. And these pillars interact and relate to each other systemically in incredibly complex ways. One of the things that we see is that countries with high levels of positive peace also have higher per capita income, high levels of resilience to crises such as COVID-19, political shocks, ecological threats, better environmental outcomes, higher measures of well-being, and better performance on development goals. Now, there's also a very strong correlation with the SDGs. We see that 85% of the SDGs 169 targets are relevant to at least sort of 2 pillars of positive peace. The only area that we don't see that largely is for free flow of information and low levels of corruption, which are actually most described in SDG 16. So something to note there. Now, when we break out the positive peace indicators per domain, we see something pretty interesting. This is the overall positive peace score globally, which has improved 2.5% over the last decade. So if we then look at institutions, this is generally operations of government, we see that there has been more, that it is very slowly, progressively improved, right? If we see things like structures, which are things that are embedded in society, so specifically things like poverty, GDP, for example, and measures of GDP, we see a significant improvement, largely a reflection of higher levels of equality in society. But what we have seen over the last decade is a significant decrease in the attitudes domain, so which runs very counterintuitively to the improvements in structures. What does this look like in an individual country? I've pulled out the United States because this is where well, a lot of us are today, but this could apply to many other countries around the world. So on the left-hand side, you see the positive peace indicators, and you see that the largest deteriorations have been quality of information that people have access to. You know, a term commonly used here, for example, is fake news, factionalized elites, which is the reality or the impression that the government does not represent the people or is controlled by a very small group of people, and group grievances, as well as restrictions on freedom of the press as well. These are all also generally considered characteristics of authoritarian regimes. So this is contributing to, running parallel to, correlates with some of the global trends in civil unrest we've been seeing. There's been a sharp rise in the level of civil unrest over the last decade. The number of riots, general strikes, and anti-government protests has more than doubled. Europe has had the largest number of protests, riots, and strikes, although the majority of those have been peaceful. And civil unrest in sub-Saharan Africa has risen more than 800%. This is a breakout, you know, sort of based on types of governance, in which we do see a general increase in civil unrest in all of these, but especially in what is deemed to be here flawed democracies. So, you know, the general impression that there is a measure of inequality and people protesting those measures. So I'd just like to finish today. I couldn't not talk about COVID-19 and peace, of course. We've got a dedicated paper on this that came out about a month and a half ago. We expect most of the indicators on the Global Peace Index to deteriorate. Military expenditure may improve because countries will need all of that money essentially to be able to prop up their own economies. We see a change in the types of sort of crimes that are being committed, but we do generally expect that to return to how it was once the COVID pandemic has subsided. We do expect the US and Europe to see an increase in political instability in general. US-China relations are deteriorating, and that could have wider global implications. Support for UN peacekeeping operations and development aid is expected to significantly decrease. That could have significant repercussions on countries that are currently receiving aid, and even countries that are you know, developed are likely to be impacted. Now, I'd like to leave you very quickly with this thought regarding the SDGs and the progress of the SDGs. On the right-hand side, you have an SDG 16 progress report that IEP generated that came out in March 2019. And I'd just like to raise the issue of where we are in terms of data collection for a lot of the things related to SDG 16. In this report, we noted that of the 56 indicators included in SDG 16 plus, less than half have officially recognized data sources. In 2018, 5 of the 12 SDG targets were not being measured by any country. Just 4 of the 44 indicators in SDG 16 have data for the 163 countries that we tracked. Now, this is, you know, this is a very apt time to sort of reconsider how we are doing, because obviously we're reaching the 5-year mark of the SDGs in general. So, you know, I think it's a very valid exercise. We're actually seeking foundation partners to make this possible, as well as for the development of a US Peace Index that I think would be extremely relevant to the time as well. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Michael, thank you so much for the work of your institute and your contributions today. Okay, now I would like to introduce our third panelist, Waqar Gilani, who will focus on the rise of violence against journalists and right to access information for strong institutions. Mr. Gilani is a Pakistan-based journalist with more than 15 years of experience of chasing stories of human rights violations, freedoms of religion, expression and press, religious extremism and persecutions, rights of marginalized sections of society, security, politics, and geopolitics. During the years, Mr. Gilani has contributed to a number of local and international publications, such as the News International, the New York Times, the Guardian, and the Wall Street Journal, among others. Mr. Gilani, welcome.
Thank you.
And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Paula. Thank you very much for this wonderful introduction. Can you hear me properly? Okay.
Very well.
First of all, I thank you, Journalist and Writers Foundation, for giving me this opportunity to speak on such an important subject on the sidelines of United Nations General Assembly's annual session. So, respected panelists and dear audience, in my brief discussion, I will be talking about rise of violence against journalists, and right to access to information for strong institutions in a country like Pakistan. The subject is important for every other country, but particularly it becomes more important and crucial for developing countries like Pakistan, where Pakistan is actually sixth largest population of the world, and that actually makes more important for the country to deal with this subject and matter, particularly when freedom of expression is actually facing different multiple challenges. So, Pakistan is trying to effectively pursue the targets under Sustainable Development Goals derived by the United Nations. Among others, SDG 16 is also a prime target where Pakistan, along with the civil society help, is trying to build some institutions and making some policies and laws. And for particularly in that section for 16.10, which is actually access to information and press freedom and related to my subject, there are efforts to make more better laws for access to information, and also some guidelines and policies for the safety and protection of journalists. But target 16.10 of the SDGs specifically aims to promote means of access to information and freedom, generally by making laws and policies and strengthening institutions. Target 16.10 calls to ensure public access to information and protect fundamental freedoms in accordance with national legislation and international agreements. Efforts are underway with the help of civil society groups to make laws to ensure access to information and to curb violence against journalists. However, the process is slow and there is clear difference in theory and practice. The global media rights organizations have observed the press freedom and freedom of expression situation not up to satisfactory level in Pakistan. The Reporters Without Borders and International Media Rights Body, in its 2020 annual report, declared Pakistan 3 points down from 2019 on the World Press Freedom Index. The index is published looking at various factors to assign an overall score relating to the freedom of the press each year. It ranked Pakistan 145th out of 180 countries, which was actually 3 degrees down as compared to 2019. In the last year, according to different press, media, and other freedom organizations and civil society reports, there have been more than or nearly 100 different types of attacks on media groups or media persons in different parts of the country. These attacks involve physical harm, mental torture, verbal threats, and harassment through different means, especially exercising power and authority, also allegedly by the state or state-owned institutions. There is a strong impression that the present democratic regime in the country, allegedly backed by the military establishment, is systematically curbing media freedom and independence, particularly those critical of its performance. There is strong impression that military, by and large, controls most of the media houses, especially electronic or TV channels. It uses media for the news and propaganda of its choice in the name of national interest of the country. Apparently, this is to counter media propaganda by its arch rival neighboring India, another largest democracy, where media seems influenced under the slogan of nationalism and patriotism. A recent example is where an online story about the alleged assets beyond means of a family of a recently retired and influential army general was actually published by a new online group, an old journalist who operated online news agency working, and he actually the general was quickly offered a lucrative job by the government after his retirement and later appointed special advisors to Prime Minister too. The media quite miseries, and exposed the true situation of access to information and freedom of expression when people saw that no big media house ran that news or aired that news or even copied that news to tell the people about that story. Rather than that, after certain alleged pressures of the government, all the media houses issued clearly a contradiction and clarification by that military general about that story. And they did not run that actual story. And similarly, what happened after the story, that the Security Exchange Commission of Pakistan, which is a body that regulates companies and such organizations, its press officer was actually picked up by certain organizations which are allegedly linked to security and military establishment, and he was freed after some days. And allegedly, the impression is that he was questioned about the leaking of that information, which was protected by that department or that commission. Similarly, another owner of the biggest media house organization of the country is under arrest for last 6 months because of a 34 years old property transaction. And impression is that this is all political because the media house was critical of the present regime. And since last 6 months, there have been no formal charge sheet against the media house owner, or he has any case been put before the court of law. Similarly, there are other incidents where we see that access to information or freedom of expression is being curbed, where journalists are being picked up for criticizing the government regime or military establishment on social media or in their stories. Sometimes when we see there is a critical of the government and military establishment dropped by the newspapers in addition after some hours. So the journalists, those differ with the military establishment policies, are allegedly removed from their jobs by media houses because of certain pressure. Choice vocabulary and use of words by the journalists criticizing government and military establishment, however, remains a big question from the government and military for the justification of its use of authority. But it cannot be acceptable when it turns into violence. These situations are not seen only in political of the country. Controlling remains an almost big god in Pakistan. Along with this, a large-scale polarization of media in the country is also a serious question and issue, which is actually affecting the performance of independent media. Recently, country's Prime Minister Imran Khan, speaking in America and United Kingdom, said that Pakistani media is freer than any other country, and he said that the right of freedom cannot be justified when they actually overly criticize the government. But actually, this is condemned by civil society groups when it comes or turns into violence against journalists in such a way. Difference of opinion is seriously required to build a healthy society, but challenge in Pakistan is how state or governments or even sometimes journalists react to this difference of opinion. Lack of tolerance and violent verbal or physical reaction to opinions and news are becoming a norm. Sadly, a balanced approach is seriously required to allow independent media and freedom of expression to flourish. Similarly, access to information is selective. It is easy to get access to information for easy stories, but it is very complex for sensitive stories. As I mentioned above in one example, where the SECP Security Exchange Commission officers were kidnapped or picked up by the security establishment for the alleged involvement of leaking of their story. In this backdrop of SDG 16.10 for access to information and violence against journalists, there is need to do a lot for Pakistan. State and political regimes need to opt a balanced approach and should absorb criticism rather opting violent way to curb freedoms of expression and media. There is need to implement existing laws and policies in a proper way, and they should not abuse of encouraged environment, media, and its Pakistan still lacks a credible database of crime and violence against journalists as per SDG 16.10. Effective legislation and a proper implementation of laws related to access to information is still required. There is need to create a supporting environment that helps in the growth of independent media rather opting one-sided or polarized approach. We cannot bring behavioral changes either in the state institutions or in the civil society or general public without having a consensual and balanced approach towards SDGs and making institutions better through policies and laws. There is need for a proper regulatory framework that helps in freedom of expression in educated and responsible way. Use of social media balanced and independently by journalists is also a challenge in this polarized atmosphere, and media houses and forums of editors have a big role in that. And they can build their role by shaping trainings, debates, and discussions on this subject. Similarly, there is need for protection and safety mechanisms by the media houses for their staff, those are on duty. The challenges, just to conclude, the challenges for Pakistan for a free and independent media are multiple, and solution is two-way. To stop criticism in a violent way by the powerful ones is not justifiable at all. There is need for a collective and balanced approach to tolerate each other and enjoyable freedom and media and expression in a reasonable way. Pakistan still needs to do a lot for this. Unless we move gradually and consensually move forward towards freedoms of media and expression will remain a challenge and it will remain under threat in the country. As Paula in her earlier discussion said that there is need for behavioral changes. So the biggest challenge for Pakistan to ensure freedom of expression and freedom of media and to curb violence against journalists is to bring behavioral changes within the institutions which are owned by the state and within the civil society and within the media houses. So that's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gilani, for your remarks and contributions to today's panel. And now I would like to introduce our fourth and final panelist, Dr. Sheikh Mohammad Al-Tafur Rahman, who will focus on access to justice for transparency and accountability in governance. Dr. Rahman is a human rights lawyer and faculty member of the School of Global Studies at Thammasat University in Thailand. He has a PhD in human rights and peace studies from Mahidol University, also in Thailand. He's born in Bangladesh and began his professional career through voluntary services and community support programs. Since 1999, he's been working on human rights and development in 12 Asian countries and with many organizations, including the Ford Foundation, CARE, among others. His area of expertise comprises international human rights mechanism, election, democratization, conflict transformation, emergency management, and application of human security framework. Dr. Ahmad Rahman.
Okay,
sorry.
Thank you.
Can you hear me well?
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
I can hear you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the Journalists and Writers Foundation to invite me in this August program, and especially to talk about SDG 16, which is very close to my heart. Not because it is important thing, but also I believe that a lot of the effort that we are putting in terms of development are surrounding many specific issues rather than the one which need a whole lot of attention from the international community is getting very less, which is SDG 16. So probably that's one of the reasons why I feel very, it is important to discuss about this issue more than the other. So thanks, Journalists and Writers Foundation, to take this initiative. Dear panelist and the listener and the viewer, my discussion point is about the access to justice, which is again one of the component of SDG 16. Without going to the background of the discussion, and I know that all of our participants quite familiar with the discussion, I want to go straight to the point where the SDG 16 and the component of access to justice, what does that really means, and how this is going to affect a lot of other institutions. What is the nature of SDG 16's access to justice component vis-a-vis the other component in a functional modality? What is the challenge of measuring this particular component, and how to overcome this situation? I would also like to go a little bit more detail from the text that we have already in terms of what UNDP has come up with and what UN has been doing, rather than some of the practical challenges that we are facing in our day-to-day life. So with that notion, let us start in the discussion process. First of all, SDG 16 and the access to justice component has a clear characteristics of overlapping feature. So it is not something that goes alone. It is not something stands alone as a achievable component. Rather, it has the overlapping feature with all other targets within the scope of SDG 16. So if we think about the strong institution, it has a clear relationship with the notion of judiciary system itself. When we talk about peace, when we talk about the war kind of situation, or extrajudicial killing, or trafficking, or child rights, these are also some of the components that overlaps with the notion of access to justice. So in that regard, the feature of overlapping is a very important characteristics of the access to justice component. The second component that I think is also important to understand when we discuss about access to justice, the understanding about the access is not uniform in everywhere. So the word of access itself has a very different kind of connotation depending on where you are. So for example, a person in a society which pretty much hierarchical, the notion of access is very different than the person who is living in a free society. So the interpretation of that access to justice itself are pretty much used by the dominant political force in the society, in the country, for their own benefit in many senses, in many cases. And that's what really makes a lot of other consequence, a lot of other feature, which relatively impacting the human rights condition of the country. So with that discussion, if we just move ourselves to a very specific kind of challenges that we face when it comes to SDG 26 access to justice component, the indicator that we use to assess that access to justice is basically two. 16.3.1 and 16.3.2. That's two. The first one is all about the idea of criminal, what you call crime reputation, and then the other one is unsentenced detainee. If we just think about the indicator itself, we can see the stark contrast with what UN itself perceive as the indicator of rule of law. Under the UN system, we know there is at least minimum 135 indicator regarding the rule of law, whereas SDG 16 is only calculating 2 out of this 135. So the gap is enormous, and it is very obvious that just by report on the criminal prosecution and the detainee, we cannot obviously understand the whole state of access to justice. Yeah. There are so many other issues; those are relevant here. But unfortunately, the the report of SDG justice is unable to really capture the whole notion of access to justice itself. So that's really my third component of the discussion. Now, the fourth component of the discussion, and I think that's also very important, the way we use those indicators, the way we collect the data for the reporting or for the voluntary report or the progress report, even in that case, are often very much restricted in the nature. As we all know, that our shipment from the MDG to SDG happened just to bring ourselves from those narrow interpretation of development and move towards a very inclusive idea of sustainable development. But whereas when you're talking about this collection method of the data, how we process the report, we often focus ourselves on a very restricted way of collecting data, rather than getting it from the third source, or even the possibility of civil society participation and providing a subsidiary data in that regard is often very restricted. So if this is the case, we can see that the only available source of data is our government institutions. And unfortunately, most of the government institutions are not really capable enough to do that kind of data support. Yeah. So if we don't have the data, if we don't have those information, we're not going to achieve the right state. We don't understand the right state. And of course, the policy formation cannot take place. This is a very big challenge. And that leads me to my fifth point of the discussion. And I think this is again a very important issue when you're talking about the participation and the authority of the state over some of its institutions. For example, when we are talking about state institutions are supporting data, we know that some of the institutions could be very much biased depending on what is the political structure and establishment of that country. So depending on that, a country establishment can easily motivate and to some extent they can change the data, they can change this information, those are available. And if this is the case, that means we are basically assessing a country on a complete wrong data, or complete wrong set of information. And that really gives us a very, I would say not a very positive kind of situation. If we just look about some of the extreme kind of government and strong institutions, strong government emerging in many countries, what they are doing, they are manipulating the judiciary. And that's exactly what is happening in many countries. And what we are seeing that the tool judiciary as an independent pillar of the state, it has been changed to be a tool of excessive power or control, whatever we can say. Yeah, and that also gives us the discussion of it is one of the way how the human rights situation are being really violated in many domestic levels. So when you're talking about SDG and you're saying about the national support as an indicative feature and international support as a normative feature or comparative feature, we are lost. We are lost because none of those are connected. So these are some of the very basic challenges I try to bring in the discussion, and I think that it is really time because we are passing the phasing time. We are passing the time to progress, creating more progress report. So this is really the time to reflect ourselves and especially reflect the those who are at the policy making stage to see and invade that whether it is a correct policy, is a correct process, the framework that we are really focusing on, whether this is really functional framework or not. We need to challenge that thing, and if it is needed, we need to go back and review. I mean, that's what happened over time. So if needed, we need to review the whole thing, and we need to see how things could be adjusted, corrected, and bring for the betterment of the protection of human rights and ensuring the access to justice. I would try to stop here because there are so many other issues, and I think the Q&A session will bring those things together. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your time and your contributions, Dr. Rahman. Now we're going to enter the Q&A session, final portion of today's panel. And I'm going to ask all of our panelists to come back on stage and keep their microphones muted as we're having some echo in the background. Until it's time to talk, if you could please keep your mics muted. Wonderful. here you all are. Let me thank you again, each one of you, for taking the time to joining such a relevant conversation today around important dimensions of this Global Goal 16. And again, to thank the Writers and Journalists and Writers Foundation for bringing us all together at a crucial time. So I would like to, as the moderator of this panel discussion, I'd like to start with, would like to hear from your own reflections when it comes to the increasingly important role that youth is playing in peace processes. I'd like to hear a little bit more about how you see youth and their opportunities and challenges when it comes to the specific dimensions that you tackle for Global Goal 16. There's quite a bit of momentum right now around the world in terms of elevating and supporting youth as the main agents of change, but really from not just hearing their voices, bringing them to the decision-making tables and work together to forge change. So that's my question for all of you and whoever would like to tackle it first. Do I have a volunteer?
Yeah,
Michael.
I'd be very happy to. So yeah, I mean, I think the participation of youth has been critical in many ways to actually sort of, you know, and responsible primarily for the large shift that we've seen, especially in the UN. I mean, there's kind of sort of been an internal and external acknowledgement that there needs to be reform within the UN. But I mean, this is really, especially leading into UN 75, being pushed by youth of the caliber of Greta Thunberg, but also all of the mass of youth working behind the scenes. And I think the technological innovation that we've sort of seen over the last 5 to 10 years that allows, you know, groups of youth to be able to come together and kind of sort of provide a level of pressure that had never been seen before has had considerable impact. So in terms of what I think is going to happen in the next 5-10 years, that'll continue and definitely should.
But they definitely have the power to mobilize society in different ways. But they also equally, in addition to being provided access to be heard and be at the table, they need to be equipped to be real change makers through education and tools for that.
Yeah, I would definitely agree, and I would say that you know, as a research institution, we do get approached very often to and that is often the question. You know, it is a young person that comes, a group of young people that come, and they say, we really want to work on this, but what do we do? And that's where I think that those of us that aren't youth can obviously sort of provide the best support, provide that mentorship, provide that guidance as needed, and they provide the lifeblood to take it forward.
Absolutely. Anyone else would like to comment on youth?
Paula, ¿puedo
Sí.
decirlo en español?
Okay, I'll do my best.
Yes. Para mí es fundamental la educación para prevenir, bueno, el tema que yo toqué, ¿no? Para prevenir el tema del tráfico de material de abuso sexual infantil, y también que las empresas proveedoras de Internet tengan obligación de denunciar, como hay una ley federal en Estados Unidos, que sea así en el resto del mundo. Eso es muy, muy importante. Pero la educación también, porque los adultos somos migrantes en la era digital, pero los niños no. Y de todas maneras, ambos necesitamos educarnos.
Let's see if I remember. There were, but mostly what Judge Molina is saying, that education is key here. Access to education is key in terms of understanding the threats, the cyber threats, when it comes to which she alluded earlier on during her presentation, and the dangers for minors. And also the way we hold corporations accountable when they are providing their services and operating globally and locally. Thank you, Natalia. Very good point. Anyone else?
Okay, well, I just want to share a very small, very brief idea. I mean, definitely youths are the most important part for future. And when you're talking about the development thing, it is very important to orient them with what sort of development we are talking. Yeah. Uh, but very encouragingly, most of the youth population within developed and developing world, they are very pro-green, if I say in the very straightforward way. They are a very rebellion in some extent against the so-called establishment, negative impact of the establishment. So these are some of the positive way. They need to be educated. That is true. So information is a very important. Access to information is a very important component in there. Education is a very important part there. What sort of education we are providing. So I would say the SDG, in a way, it has to be a holistic way for the youth population. But one important area within the scope of SDG 16, I think, is very important for the youth as well, which is a lot of international institutions are not that strong. So when you're talking about strong institutions, we are actually sleeping from there. I mean, we know that what happened with the WHO very recently. I mean, this is a pandemic time, and what sort of challenge WHO has to face on the face of the operationalization of its own activity. Similarly, we can talk about a lot of discussion about UN itself. So the thing is, youth could be another vanguard for next step of creating a better institution for the world, with a new idea of reform, placing themselves within the process of not the leadership, if not the leadership, but at least in the process of consultation. That could be one way to consult the participation of youth in the entire decision making process.
Thank you, Dr. Rahman. Any more comments on that?
Yeah, may I speak, please?
Absolutely,
So
go
I think
ahead.
you have rightly mentioned, and as Dr. Rahman also mentioned, I think youth has very critical role because they are the future leaders. And in a country like Pakistan, we have more than 50% population of the country, which is actually, we say, youth bulge. I mean, they are between the ages of 20 and 35. So they have a critical role in that. But the challenge is actually, as Dr. Rahman also mentioned, that behavioral changes in institutions. And that is the biggest challenge, because the organizations or the secondary organizations of the United Nations, I mean, they are not enforcing things in the countries. I mean, their role is like of a catalyst, or they can just slightly push the things, or they can recommend things to different societies and countries. But the challenge within these societies, and particularly developing countries, is actually to bring behavioral changes within the state-owned institutions and to promote education so that youth can play a better positive role in the coming days. Thank you.
Well stated. Could not agree more. We're going to go now to some of the questions we're getting from the audience. Thank you, audience, for participating. Michael, I have one question for you. If you analyze the Global Peace Index 2015 to 2020, what are some of the trends emerged within the last 5 years? Does the data give us some information for the projection of positive peace in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, so we generally see trends through the GPI and positive peace, and it's kind of sort of a bit like the Titanic or a slow moving ship, right? So you generally kind of you don't tend to see, especially when you're looking at it globally, when any major differences between countries tend to kind of sort of smooth out. You don't tend to see sort of an immediate shift year on year, and even a sort of a 5-year time span is relatively short. So we largely expect levels of peacefulness to follow that metric, so to essentially slightly decline, similar to positive peace, especially with view of the ongoing civil unrest. We expect positive peace and civil unrest to continue to increase in the US and in Europe. as well as in Africa. The thing that's kind of sort of been a bit of the spanner in the works, which can potentially make it horribly worse, or perhaps has some silver lining, is COVID-19. So we, it's too early for us to kind of sort of assess that based on the data that we have, but that will significantly have an impact due to the massive economic impact that it's had specifically. So largely the prognosis is not great.
Thank you, Michael. I'm waiting for more questions to be sent my way. Here we go. And sometimes they're not addressed to any particular panelist, so feel free to answer as you see, please. How closely do you work with grassroots youth organizations where real transformation occurs? You challenge your constituents to give youth a voice and a seat at the decision-making table. This was related to the question that we, to some extent, already addressed, but now perhaps more directly, are you working closely with youth in shaping their involvement and participation?
So I'd actually, if it's all right with you, Paula, I'd actually like to jump on this one to
Go ahead.
So we have a network of 1,500 IEP ambassadors that essentially help provide training and help distribute IEP research throughout the world. That's an open process, and out of the 1,500 ambassadors, the majority, if not practically all, are youth. The reason I bring that up is because we actually have an open cohort for ambassadors right now as we speak. So if you are interested in becoming an IEP ambassador, please don't hesitate to do so. Visit our webpage and you'll be able to register there.
Great, thank you for flagging that. Absolutely. I would like the organizers that, as a follow-up from this conversation, we share the number of resources that you brought to our attention today, so they can learn more and get involved with some of your activities. Anyone else would like to pitch on that very specific question of how are you, from your space in the Global Goal 16 work, are engaging with youth? Any examples?
Okay, I think I can just share very briefly about our own work. As an academic institution, we do work with the youth. I mean, that's what our area. But beside that, we are creating a lot of extra curriculum program. For example, summer program. It's a kind of immersion program that youths are coming and they're coming from across the different countries of the world, both south and north. They are trained for a certain period of time, 2 weeks, and then they sent to the community. They stay with the community people. They learn the community activity and challenges, and also they design some of the solutions for the community. So it's a very much problem-solving method, but very grassroots oriented. So they have to stay with the community people for 1 month and then observe what are the problem and solve the problem along with the community participation. That's just one of the examples. But yeah, that kind of activity that we are doing.
Thank you for sharing. I was just told that Natalia Judge Molina works with organizations and volunteers that provide training about different types of crimes. That's important. It's access to education and it's training at all levels, youth and beyond. So that's worth mentioning. At my association, the UN Association of the National Capital Area, we work through Model UN. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Model UN. That's the framework that we use to bring about knowledge of relevant global issues to middle and high school students in our jurisdiction. But it's not only the access to that knowledge, it's also the tools that they're going to need to be effective when it comes to advocating for those issues, advocating for themselves, and one day perhaps representing their countries. So communication, negotiation skills, those are critical skills. If we want youth to succeed, is we need to give them access, but we also need to give them the tools to be effective agents of change. So that's my 2 cents of sharing of what we're doing at the local level. Okay, I have another question. How can we ensure good governance in countries where the rule of law and generally constitutionalism are not upheld? Who would like to answer that one?
I think that directs to me. Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, how can we ensure?
Read it again. How can we ensure good governance in countries where the rule of law and generally constitutionalism are not upheld?
Fantastic. I think in my discussion, I try to point those very basic issues that when you talk about SDG 16 and the component of access to justice, it is very poorly framed, as I said, and the indicators are very poorly framed there. So it doesn't really capture the whole idea of good governance in those indicators at all. So it is very unlikely that when there is not good governance, the access to justice is really there. Hardly any presence there. I just give you a very simple example. A war-torn country where there is a civil war or a military conflict is going on, how can we ensure there is access to justice for all the people there? I mean, it's impossible. It's quite impossible. But to capture that kind of phenomena in a progression report or bring that in the context of discussion is oftentimes missing in the present framework that we have. So that's one big argument. The second argument is when you talk about the access issues to the judiciary, it is pretty much contextualized issue. So without considering that context, we cannot really come up with a single set of standard for everything. So that's again a very big challenge. So yeah, I am pretty much in solidarity with the same question. And I think this is what I have been trying to push in my speech as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to comment on this?
Yeah, I'd be very happy to add to that. I'm in complete agreement. A lot of the least peaceful countries are caught in what we call sort of a negative feedback loop, right? So it's weak institutions providing poor services that lead to an increase in conflict that leads to weaker institutions, right? And one of the challenges there is that the solution to that isn't specifically rule of law. You can't have rule of law in a country where people don't have any freedom to live, right? So invariably the solution is a lot broader than specifically tackling the question of rule of law. And basically all elements related to good governance need to be reinforced, largely along the lines of sort of the positive peace framework that I was describing before, in order for the rule of law to become effective.
Anyone else on this?
Maybe Paula.
Okay.
I could like that it's necessary to unite in common ideas and form organization maybe, but organization strong.
Thank you. You're alluding to the importance of coming together and collaborating through partnerships, right? Colaboración, el poder de las colaboraciones.
Yeah.
¿Sí? Okay. Anyone else on this? Oh. Okay. Just looking at the chat. We are nearing the end, and I want to give each one of you an opportunity to ask a burning question from the rest of the panel if you haven't had a chance yet through the internal chat that we have backstage. Please feel free, and also then to give me your your summary highlights of what you like the audience to remember and reflect upon about the dimension of Global Goal 16 that you have addressed today as we enter the 75th anniversary of the UN. And this is really a time for, it's a monumental time for tackling unprecedented challenges, but also to come up with a new way of living and building a sustainable world.
Maybe a concluding statement in that regard. Thank you, Paula, for bringing. The whole idea of a judiciary is just out of the discussion. It's just concluding statement, so we can say that. That many governments in the world are using judiciary as a tool to perpetuate their authority and power. This is a very scary situation. When you're talking about judiciary, which is a guard to protect the human rights of the ordinary people, instead of protecting the human rights, it is acting to violate the human rights of the people. So this is a very reverse process now going on internationally. And I would say where many governments, those are internationally very well reputed, but back in home, the issues like extrajudicial killing, border killing, prosecution of political minorities and political opposition, these are rampant through the judiciary that are taking place. Yeah, and what we're seeing is the idea of global cooperation in some sort of alliance or to some extent even supporting some of the economic gain. Those governments are being supported and endorsed by international community in many ways. As I said, data are not really coming in a neutral way, so we are not getting the accurate picture about the judiciary independence and functionality of the judiciary. So it is acting as a reverse tool to perpetuate the power and authority of many regimes across the world. So I think that should be one of the element of the future thought. Thank you.
Sorry, Paula.
Thank you. Yes.
I would like to thank you for the opportunity to be here. My conclusion is that what we are doing here in the key to grow and develop, we need to work together and embrace collaboration to ensure a better world for everyone. I think.
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, so I'm actually glad that I get this opportunity to build on my last remarks, which were the prospect is not good. I felt like the temperature of the room just went. So I'd like to clarify that statement in perhaps a slightly more optimistic way, and that is to reinforce the youth leadership and participation component that we've already discussed, and the amazing advancements that have been done and will be done, no doubt. Number two, the UN 75 and the whole reckoning that the UN is going through, I think will lead to extremely good things at a much faster pace with regards to the SDGs. Third, the degree of technological innovation, perhaps not in terms of computing processes, but certainly in terms of communication between partners. One of the positive outcomes, if you will, of COVID, I think could also have a significant impact on how we approach the issue going forward, positive impact. And then largely the element of resilience. A lot of the countries that have been impacted by COVID are going to really be considering, what are the additional measures that they should be putting in place? How should multilateral cooperation be reinforced to deal with these kind of crises in the future? So in many ways, I don't think, COVID never comes at a good time, but I think that there's a lot that we can learn from it that could lead to positive impact in the future.
Very well said. Thank you, Michael. Mr. Gilani?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think SDG 16 is directly related to access to justice and access to information, and actually it is linked to the crime happening in a society. So that is why it is very important, I think, to discuss this issue. And the biggest thing which I mentioned, and you also mentioned in your earlier discussion, that the behavioral changes within the institutions that are very important, because you cannot bring change in a society without behavioral changes within the institutions, particularly owned by the state. And for that, we need a two-way approach, which needs dialogue, which needs tolerance, which needs acceptance of others' views. So if we bring that, then we can mold a society towards a sustainable development goal, towards justice and freedom of expression and information. Without that, we will be facing huge challenges. So that's all. So I think the biggest issue with the developing country is to bring behavioral changes within the institutions for the making of those SDGs possible. Thank you very much.
Well, thank all of you for taking the time to participate in today's panel and to being a part of, through your organizations and work, shaping the Sustainable Development Agenda on a very, very important goal, Global Goal 16, which is really, as we alluded throughout this conversation, critical when it comes to also enabling the achievement of the other global goals. We really need to build and sustain peace in order to be able to have access to quality education, have access to health, and so on. So the power of education and advocacy is something that resonates, and obviously in some parts of the world is much more challenging than in others. But we're also all much more interconnected around the world, and tools and ways to help each other and collaborate. So while we are facing unprecedented challenges, as you mentioned, Michael, COVID-19 is exacerbating every other challenge that we've been facing, from climate to inequalities. But it's also teaching us a lesson in terms of re-examining the way we've been living, which has not been sustainable. How are we behaving with other human beings, with other countries, with the planet? We have to re-examine everything, and it's going to be a test for being resilient. You're absolutely right about that. But I am, despite those challenges that can be quite overwhelming when one thinks about them, I also have hope, tremendous hope in humanity. I think that this is happening at a very particular time because the world really needs to evolve to a new and more sustainable stage. So we're in this together. I think the pandemic is showing us that we're definitely all in this together, and it's bringing a lot of positive solutions and aspects that people are working on. So once again, thank you so much to each one of you for your time today. Keep up the good work. Stay connected. We can exchange information backstage. I'd love to stay in touch with you, explore collaborations. And again, a big, big thank you to the Journalists and Writers Foundation for bringing us all together. Excellent program. Thank you so much. Be safe. Stay well. Bye.
Bye.